2, maybe 3 hours a week. The other 165 are spent elsewhere. Some of it's given to sleeping. But outside of the sleeping, the bulk of our time is spent at work. And here Paul, at the place of business, begins to give the gospel. And he talks to those people who are there. And he's proclaiming to them the gospel of Christ. So if you're in school, the marketplace is the school. If you're in business, the marketplace is the business. If you're in a home, maybe you don't work outside of the home, the marketplace is the people around you. What do we say to these people? Well, think about the people in the business world. The people who are making their way. They are self-made people. They make things and they sell things and they earn a living and they do a very good job at that. And what Paul comes to them and says is something along the lines of what we see in verse 26. It says in verse 26, from one man, God made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And God determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek Him and perhaps reach out to Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. Paul is expressing to these people that God has given us all that we have. So you come into various places of business and you find these guys and ladies too who feel like they have picked themselves up by their bootstraps and they've made a living for themselves and they've done what they could and now they've reached some pinnacle of success. Or you go to the school and you find kids that have in their minds what they're going to do in the days ahead and they've got some plans and this and that. And there's kind of a understanding that I'm a self-made person. I can make things happen and I will survive. I will make a living. I will support my family and I'll get on in life. And what Paul comes to them and says, God has given us everything that we have. God placed us. He determined the places where we should live. God determined the exact times that we should live. And even though we think that we're self-made, the reality is that we weren't even able to birth ourselves into the world. We weren't able to birth ourselves into a free economy. God placed us somewhere. God put us in a particular time frame. And it was God's doing that made us arrive at the place where we are. And the message that Paul gives to these people is, God's in charge, God is sovereign, and if you think that you're self-made, be alert, you are not. And what you need is the gospel of Christ, who takes people who feel like they are self-made and recognizing that God is sovereign above all, and that the sovereign God sent His Son Jesus to die for the sins of men. And so those of us who have been crushed by our efforts at being self-made and realized in the process that we don't have that much to offer, that we're not that great, that God is sovereign and that we can be crushed over the sovereignty of God. But in His mercy, He shows us that the gospel lifts us up and makes whole people out of broken people. We should be telling the truth and we should be telling our story. So Paul speaks to the people in the synagogue, the church setting. Paul speaks to the people in the marketplace, the business setting. And then we see that he speaks to a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Now, unless you have studied philosophy or have a great memory, what the Epicureans and what the Stoics taught might be a little bit vague to us. Epicurus was a philosopher and he taught that pleasure is the chief goal in life. And he felt like you could achieve intellectual serenity, just peace, by overcoming the disturbing passions and superstitious fears, and especially the fear of death. So he was a materialist. That is, he dealt with the material goods of the world. He believed that at death the person just ceases to be and that there's no afterlife, so there's no concern for what comes next. He believed in the gods, that there was some divine power, but he taught that they don't get involved in human affairs. So here you have these people who follow the teachings of Epicurus. They pursue pleasure. And while it might be true that many pursued pleasure all out, like just hedonistically giving themselves to any kind of pleasure they had, most of them did not. They put some limits on what they were willing to do. They learned to say no to some things so that they could enjoy the pleasures that they wanted. So it wasn't that they were trying to all out pursue 17,000 different types of pleasure. But they would isolate the pleasures that meant something to them, and they would structure their lives in such a way that they could pursue those pleasures that gave to them some means of happiness. How many in the world today are lulled to sleep by that same philosophy? They may have never heard of Epicurus, but they're well schooled in his philosophy. The idea not to bother people around you too much, but find what it is that makes you happy and give yourself to that and settle down inside of that. Don't worry about what takes place after this life is over. Just settle in. A message for another time, but there really could be probably a complete series preached about Epicurean philosophy inside of the church. Don't bother me with what's important. Let me watch my movies. Let me give myself to the pursuit of the things that mean something to me. Don't talk to me about the fact that my neighbors are not going to heaven. Leave me isolated. Leave me be. But in this context, we're talking about people who are in that way. As long as they have the car they want to drive, the house they want to live in, the life that they've kind of imagined for themselves, this is what they pursue. So what does Paul say to them at verse 26, much like I had mentioned earlier? From one man, God made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. He determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God has given us everything that we have. We owe Him. Verse 28, for in Him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, Paul quotes one of their poets, we are His offspring. So Paul reminds these Epicureans that it's not for this pursuit of pleasure that we live. It's in God that we live and move and have our being. The pursuit of pleasure will always end up like chasing after the wind. There is never enough pleasure. The pursuit of pleasure is a black hole that can never find a bottom. You constantly have to add more. And so as these people began to make their idols, or make their altars to the various idols, pleasures of various kinds, they ended up having to make up this altar to the unknown God. Because behind all this pursuit of pleasure, there was the recognition that something does not satisfy. So our job is to talk to people who are giving themselves to pleasure with no thought of the afterlife and declare to them the truth. Declare to them that those who are self-fulfilled or think that they are self-fulfilled need the gospel of Christ, because it is in God that we live and move and have our being. There is another group that Paul spoke to. It was the philosophers who were Stoics. They followed the teachings of a guy named Zeno, and he thought that good lies in the soul itself, and wisdom and restraint delivers a person from passions and desires that tend to perturb the ordinary life. So they tried to live in harmony with nature, and they put a whole lot of emphasis on man's rational ability. They put emphasis on man's self-sufficiency, his obedience to duty. And because they could accomplish this, they were filled with pride. They became people who were self-sufficient individuals, and they would deal with whatever came their way, and they would not let anything upset their equilibrium. And they would say things like, I will make my own way, there is no need for God. Somewhat a person with no emotion, but no deviation from the task. Is this part of the philosophy that exists in our day? How about in our own neighborhood? Our city is filled with soldiers who in some measure adopt this philosophy towards life. That there's a task, there are unpleasant things between me and the task, but these are the things that I must do. And so I will do whatever has to be done in order to accomplish the task, and I will set out and I will do that. What is a good thing in matters of war is a bad thing in matters of the heart. We cannot just plunge through life and approach the spiritual life with, I don't need anybody to help me. or having the idea that God is an unnecessary appendage. I can make my way through life. I'm self-sufficient. Paul addresses this in verse 31, where he says, "For God has set a day when He will judge the world with justice by the man He has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising Him from the dead." Paul reminds the people who are self-sufficient that there will come a day when we have to give an account before God. And so though we may feel like we've made our way through life in our self-sufficiency, it will all come crashing to an end when we stand before God and we give an answer for our souls. So these are the people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. They're church people. They think that they've absorbed the gospel when they have to accept Christ. And we need to tell them the truth, that God isn't looking for self-righteous people. He's looking for people who will trust in what Christ has done. Tell them the truth and tell them your story. There are people in the marketplace who are self-made people. And we need to tell them the truth and tell them our story. There are Epicurean philosophers who are living out their life for the sake of pleasure. And we need to tell them the truth and tell them our story, that we cannot be self-fulfilled. There are people who are philosophers of the Stoic arm, and we need to speak to them and declare the truth and tell them our story, that we cannot be self-sufficient and stand before God with any hope of salvation. This is the truth. In this passage, when Paul begins to be stirred by the hopelessness of the idols that he sees around him, he begins to talk. And he talks to everybody. He talks to people in church. He talks to people at work. He talks to people at school. He talks to his neighbors across the yard. He talks to his neighbors across the street. He makes a foray into the world of the intellectuals, the Stoics and the Epicureans. And he begins to deal with them because the simplicity of the gospel transcends every kind of barrier. And the truth is that people need to know this unknown God. And He has placed within us, who are believers, the truth. And our job, our role, our mission is to give the gospel by telling the truth of what Jesus says about Himself in the New Testament, and tell them the story that God has given us when He rescued us from our own sins. This is it. This is what we are called to do. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have the missions conference. But if we separate the missions conference from our own lives, then we have made a grievous error. And we're foolish people indeed if we will take money and send people to do what we will not do here on our own soil. God has called us to do both. And so I ask you, when was the last time that you shared the gospel with somebody who is worshiping an idol that gives them a false sense of hope, but will ultimately leave them guilty before God? I'm not asking for a complicated explanation of the truth. Just tell the truth. Tell your story. When you get to the end of Acts chapter 17 that we read earlier, we find that some people sneered. They made fun. Who are these people talking about the resurrection? And some said, well, we'll listen to you later on. We'll hear a little more about this matter. But there were some who believed. And as many as believed, God gave to them salvation. Our job isn't to try to convince people. Our job is to tell the story. Tell the truth. Tell your story. Let's bow our heads to pray. Lord, I know that You reign sovereign and supreme over everything. That You have called us and given us a responsibility to tell the story. And Lord, I ask that You would forgive us for how frequently we've kept our mouths closed, as if it is not the most precious thing in the world that You've given to us. So I ask that as we think over the next several days about the truth of Acts chapter 17, I ask that You would help us to open our mouths. Grant to us boldness of heart. And I pray that those who hear the gospel story would respond and receive life in Jesus Christ. I ask these things in the name of our Lord. Amen. As we stand and sing, the song will be